Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back into the grim dungeons and crooked corridors of medieval justice where torture wasn't a barbaric anomaly, but a sanctioned science of pain and fear. Forget the chivalric codes and courtly banquets you hear about in fairy tales. The real instruments? They were twisted iron, crushing mechanisms and devices designed to prolong agony rather than end life quickly. So tonight we're asking, what would it really be like to face the most bizarre torture devices from the Middle Ages? Where every turn could snap your joints, every belt could slice your flesh, and every chain was an extension of cruelty. Every era had its own horror, so let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always chilling to see whose nightmare we step into tonight. Now dim the lights, brace yourself, and let's unlock the gates of torture together. You awaken in a darkened chamber, your arms bound above your head by coarse ropes tied to an overhead beam. You try to move, but find that every muscle protests. You hear the creak of wood and the steady scrape of a turnspit below your feet. As the wheel turns, your ankles are drawn apart and your shoulders pulled up. At first, the stretch feels like a pain in your joints. Then the agony becomes a fire that races from your shoulders down your arms to your fingertips. This device is called the rack. Its earliest origins trace back to antiquity, but it became a fixture of medieval justice by the 14th century. Courts and inquisitors saw in it a means not only to extract confession, but to break the will of even the most stubborn prisoner. The rack consists of a stout wooden frame fitted with a roller at each end. The victim lies on a plank between them, with wrists and ankles secured to ropes or leather straps. A handle or crank attached to one roller is then turned, gradually increasing the distance between head and ankles. This relentless traction dislocates shoulders, shreds sinews, and can tear bones if the operator chooses to push beyond the limits of flesh. In practice, the rack served two purposes. Physically, it inflicted pain so severe that the body would tremble and sweat. Psychologically, it convinced the victim that resistance was futile. No amount of courage or faith could withstand that slow twist of wood and rope. Men and women begged for mercy before the rack even began its first turn because they could imagine the full horror of what was to come. Their minds filled with visions of limbs torn from sockets of flesh ripped from bone. That anticipation of pain often proved more powerful than the device itself. Operators of the rack were trained to listen for cracks and snaps. A single sharp crack might mean a joint has given way. If the interrogator wished to intensify the threat, he would allow one snap, but then pause the wheel. The victim would lie there panting in terror at what had just happened and what might happen next if they did not speak. Each rotation of the wheel carried both the promise of an end to questioning and the threat of permanent maiming. Confessions obtained under the rack often formed the basis of trials and executions. In the halls of the Inquisition, they issued public pronouncements that mercy had been offered once the victim confessed. In reality, mercy often meant a shorter rope or a lighter turn of the handle. The use of the rack spread across Europe, wherever inquisitors claimed the right to root out heresy. It became a symbol of absolute authority of church and state over the body and soul of the accused. Surviving the rack was rare. Some victims passed out under the strain. Others entered a cataleptic state from the shock to their nervous system. If the wheel was released quickly enough, bones might realign and flesh knit back together. But many who survived lived with chronic pain, crippling deformities, and the memory of screaming as their joints were wrenched from their sockets. That memory haunted them long after they left the prison, a reminder that at any moment the wheel could turn again. The psychological terror of the rack extended beyond the immediate victim. Stories of its use spread among villages and courts. A single mention of the rack in rumor could cow rebellious nobles into obedience and shepherd confessing heretics into the arms of the church. Torturers took pride in perfecting their technique so that no sign of their skill was visible. They learned to turn the wheel slowly enough to prolong agony, yet avoid immediate death. That skill turned torture into a grim art form. one that required patience, calculation, and a temperament that relished both power and pain. Today, the rack stands in museum halls as a relic of a darker age. Its simple mechanism and brutal effectiveness remind us of the lengths to which authority can go when fear is its instrument. Yet the story of the rack is also a lesson in human psychology. It shows how agony can be magnified by anticipation, and how the promise of pain can break a person's spirit before the body itself fails. In the flickering torchlight of medieval dungeons, the rack was not only a tool of torment but a statement of control over flesh and will. It was a warning to all who might challenge the power of king or church. And it remains one of history's most chilling examples of how cruelty was engineered and administered with meticulous care. Over time, the rack evolved from crude logs, lashed together into a sophisticated machine of iron and wood, designed for maximum control over both body and mind. Early versions consisted simply of a plank and 2 rollers. The victim's limbs were tied at either end, and the rollers turned by hand. Later models incorporated ratchet mechanisms that allowed the interrogator to lock the frame in place at any point in the stretch. A single click of the catch sealed the prisoner's fate in that painful position until confession or collapse. Some designs added padded head and footboards to prevent slipping and to concentrate pressure precisely on shoulder and hip joints. In the medieval workshop, the torturer served as engineer and artisan. He selected hardwoods that would not warp under strain and fitted them with wrought iron bands to reinforce the frame. He carved handles of oak or walnut to fit comfortably in calloused hands. He tested each rack for smooth operation and calibrated the tension so that the turnspit could apply steady pressure without sudden jerks that might kill or maim before the prisoner revealed secrets. He learned to apply force in measured increments so that a joint would dislocate with a faint pop rather than shatter with a crack. That expertise ensured that the victim remained alive long enough to endure the full ordeal. The rack gained its greatest notoriety in the Spanish Inquisition, where it became the centerpiece of interrogation chambers. Under orders from the crown, and the church inquisitors maintained lists of suspects to be tortured. They recorded confessions and the weight of evidence in thick ledgers. A victim's name entered the ledger that night and remained there until either confession or death. A confession obtained under torture was deemed valid if it matched testimony from other witnesses. After the rack, the prisoner might face a second trial for heresy or rebellion and could be condemned to public execution by fire. In England, the rack was installed in the Tower of London during the 16th century. It became the tool of choice for extracting information from political prisoners and conspirators. Figures such as Guy Fawkes and members of the Gunpowder Plot were threatened with the rack even if they were never actually placed upon it. The very presence of the device in the White Tower struck fear into traitors' hearts. The warders would push the wheel by night so that distant echoes of cracking wood reached the cells and unsettled every soul within. Survivors of the rack told stories of unimaginable agony. They described shoulders torn from their sockets and ankles stretched until ligaments snapped like twigs. They recounted the slow burn of torn muscle and the cold shock that followed when the wheel was released suddenly. Many spoke of a paradoxical relief when bones finally gave way. The pain then shifted from the joints to raw flesh and nerves until even the act of breathing became an ordeal. Those who lived through the rack often suffered lifelong injuries. They walked with a curious stoop or could no longer raise their arms above their heads. The portraits of these survivors show hollowed cheeks and haunted eyes. Some physicians of the age studied the aftermath of rack torture in grim fascination. They described in textbooks how to treat dislocated joints and seared sinews. They experimented with splints of wood and leather to set bones and used poultices of wine and herbs to stave off infection. A few doctors wrote that proper treatment could restore some mobility. Others declared the damage irreversible and recommended only palliative care. The medical writings of the time reflect both compassion and detachment, as doctors balanced their oath to heal against the state's demand for punishment. Beyond physical effects, the rack wielded a powerful psychological weapon. Prisoners often confessed to crimes they had never considered. Under the relentless stretch, they lost track of reality and time. The simple promise of mercy, if they spoke the truth, became a lifeline they grasped desperately. In many cases, the inquisitor repeated the process later to force the prisoner to recant or to extract details about co-conspirators. Fear of being racked again could coerce even hardened combatants into naming friends and followers. Tales spread of entire families ruined because one member broke under the wheel's pressure. Public knowledge of the rack's power spread like wildfire. Poets and pamphleteers penned laments and satires describing its horror. A single mention of the rack in a soldiery tavern could silence the rowdiest crowd. Merchants travelling from town to town warned of magistrates' cruelty in harsh syllables that echoed through market squares. Families of suspects would bribe jailers to remove the rack or to delay its use long enough for an escape. At times, bribery succeeded. Inquisitors who accepted gold earned a reputation for leaning on soft chords rather than cruel iron. By the 17th century, voices rose in protest. Philosophers and political thinkers condemned torture as unjust and unreliable. They argued that a confession under agony is but the cry of flesh in revolt and has no relation to truth. In England, the rack was finally abolished in 1640. Other European states followed suit over the next century. The Enlightenment ushered in an era of legal reform that rejected the rack and its kin in favor of more humane, if still flawed, judicial practices. Today, replicas of the rack stand in museum halls under dim lights. Visitors peer through protective barriers at the heavy beams and rusted ratchets. Information panels explain its operation and its role in history. Curators note that the rack represents a turning point in society's understanding of justice. The wheel's final twist led to new laws forbidding torture and to the modern presumption of innocence. In that way, the rack's brutality helped shape the very concept of human rights. The rack's legacy remains a stark reminder of how authority can become cruelty when unchecked. Its mechanism may be simple, but its impact on individuals and on entire societies was profound. The psychology of pain and the promise of confession under threat of dismemberment reveal the darkest corners of power. And in every museum gallery, it stands as a silent witness to the lengths to which men once went to force truth from unwilling mouths. You stand before what looks like an upright sarcophagus of wrought iron. Its twin halves gape open like the maw of some terrible beast. On each interior face, dozens of spikes thrust inward at angles calibrated to impale flesh without piercing a vital organ too quickly. The story tells that the Iron Maiden was closed around its victim so that each movement drove steel into bone. It was said to prolong agony and force witnesses to marvel at human endurance and despair. Yet the truth of its use in the Middle Ages is far more subtle and in some ways more disturbing. Origins of the Iron Maiden legend trace to later centuries. No reliable record exists of its use before the early 19th century. Instead, chroniclers in 18th century Nuremberg claimed to display such a device in a local museum. They dubbed it the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg and attributed to it a dark medieval past. Visitors flocked to see the coffin of torture reputed to have held countless heretics. The city's tour guides told grisly tales of sinners locked inside while the spikes slowly squeezed their flesh. These stories spread through Europe and became part of popular imagination of medieval cruelty. Scholars examining the design have pointed out that the spikes on surviving examples are blunt-tipped. They could bruise and press into the body, but would not pierce deeply enough to kill. The interior space is far too narrow to hold a live person without immediate collapse of lungs. A living victim could not inhale or expand their chest. In practice, the Iron Maiden could not function as an efficient instrument of execution or prolonged torment. It seems more likely that it was constructed for display rather than deployment. Even if never used on a single prisoner, the Iron Maiden's fearsome reputation served a purpose. Rumor of its existence stoked terror in those accused of heresy or sedition. It became an emblem of absolute authority. Magistrates could threaten confession under the doom of the coffin without ever tightening a single bolt. Accused men and women would confess to almost anything rather than imagine themselves trapped inside that chamber of spikes. Inquisitors and officials understood the power of symbolism. They displayed replicas of the Iron Maiden in torture chambers to inspire dread. Painted murals showed dignitaries being laid inside. Guards spoke in reverent whispers of the device's mastery of pain. Those awaiting trial heard tales whispered through damp cell bars. The moral shock of the stories was enough to extract cooperation and testimony as surely as any actual wound. This phenomenon reveals a central truth of medieval incarceration. Fear often proved as effective as physical suffering. Devices like the rack required space and skilled operators. Torture chambers were busy places. A single rack might serve dozens of prisoners over months. The Iron Maiden required far less maintenance. It could stand idle in a corner and do its work in rumor and imagination. A single glimpse of its iron bands and jagged interior was enough to break a person's resolve. In the manuscripts of the period, some scribes mock the device. They call it the Maiden of Irony, because no living soul ever emerged to validate its power. At fairs, showmen paraded wax figures in miniature coffins of steel. They sold pamphlets illustrating the savage silhouette. The pamphlets circulated among merchants and pilgrims and reached rural villages where few had seen a rack or an iron chair. Yet the Iron Maiden became shorthand for the darkest depths of human cruelty. Even after the Enlightenment began to ban torture across Europe, the Iron Maiden survived as a tourist attraction. Museums kept the relic on display with explanatory plaques that admitted uncertainty about its true use. Scholars debated its function and origin. Some argued that it was an artistic fantasy born of sensationalism. Others suggested it may have been used once or twice under exceptional circumstances. No incontrovertible evidence ever proved that anyone suffered inside its cavity. In this way, the Iron Maiden illustrates how myth can eclipse reality. The device may have been more frightening in story than in steel. Yet the belief in its power shaped proceedings in courts and prisons. Accused persons would beg for mercy simply at the threat of the coffin's gates closing. They would confess to crimes they did not commit rather than face the shrinkage of their own hopes beneath the legend's shadow. When you walk among the racks and stocks of a modern museum's torture exhibit, you may still see the Iron Maiden standing tall. Its spikes gleam in the lantern light as though poised to fulfill their grim purpose. Visitors eye it with a mixture of horror and fascination. Few ask whether it ever truly claimed a single life by impaling flesh. Instead, they confront the power of fear itself made visible. The Iron Maiden reminds us that human cruelty does not always require mechanical genius. It can rely on our own capacity for dread. A single shape of iron and the promise of suffering can unravel minds as effectively as any ornate mechanism of traction or boiling oil. In the end, the coffin of spikes may never have been closed around a living body, yet its legend locked countless souls in its iron embrace and left them broken long before they ever felt a single wound. Beyond legend and display, the Iron Maiden's cultural reverberations spread across Europe. In France, it became a motif in political satire. Pamphleteers drew cartoons of corrupt officials locked inside miniature coffins of steel. They labeled them Maiden of Conscience or Lady of Virtue to mock judges who punished the poor while letting the powerful go free. In Germany, theatrical troupes performed morality plays in which sinners walked unarmed toward a coffin that snapped shut at the climax. The audience gasped, but the actor emerged unscathed to deliver the moral of mercy rather than cruelty. These popular entertainments kept the Iron Maiden in the public mind long after its practical use had vanished. Travelers to Nuremberg in the late 17th century recorded seeing the Maiden displayed in the city's town hall. Its spikes glittered in the torchlight of civic festivals. Foreign merchants wrote home in astonishment. One Englishman described it as a princess of pain crowned in thrice 10 spears. He claimed local bailiffs showed it routinely to debtors as they tried to collect taxes. No debtor ever failed to produce payment after seeing that coffin of steel. Whether true or not, the story shows how the Iron Maiden served as a symbol of state power as much as a torture instrument. By the 18th century, antiquarians began collecting examples of medieval torture devices. They valued the Iron Maiden as a curiosity rather than evidence of past injustices. Armies of curators and collectors swapped fragments of spiked panels like trading cards. They wrote treatises on the mechanics of rack and thumbscrew, but gave only passing mention to the Iron Maiden because they doubted its authenticity. Many believed it a clever fabrication of the Renaissance imagination rather than a relic of dark inquisitions. Yet in Prussia, the Maiden was briefly revived as a tool of military discipline. During the 7 Years' War, a general reputedly threatened insubordinate soldiers with the coffin. He displayed it in his quarters as a warning. Officers passed rumors that prisoners would be locked inside if the ranks refused an order. No one ever reported an actual use. The general's discipline campaign succeeded through rumor rather than force. Soldiers obeyed as though the Maiden were more fearsome than any saber or flintlock. In literature, the Iron Maiden inspired Gothic tales of haunted castles and restless spirits. Writers described tormented ghosts trapped forever in the steel tomb. The Maiden became a character in novels alongside Dracula and Frankenstein's monster. In these stories, the device transcended its mechanical origins and became an emblem of human cruelty unleashed. The spike-lined coffin served as a symbol of the mind's darkest impulses rather than simply a means of physical torture. Today, scholars sift through archives looking for documents that mention the Iron Maiden in court records or prison inventories. They find occasional references to steel coffin or spiked chest, but no clear evidence of actual use. The Registry of Castles and Strongholds holds floor plans with spaces labelled torture chamber, yet no sketches of a maiden appear among the drawings. In the Archivio di Stato in Rome, a letter from a prison warden notes preparations for interrogations, but no mention of an iron coffin. Historians conclude that the Iron Maiden was more a product of rumor and fear than a practical instrument regularly deployed. Museums now display the Iron Maiden alongside genuine instruments of torture. They place plaques explaining the doubts about its use. Visitors learn that the devilish silhouette served chiefly as a mythic warning rather than a common fate. Tour guides emphasize the importance of separating myth from history. They point out that devices such as the rack, the strappado, and the thumbscrew saw widespread use. Meanwhile, the Maiden emerges as an artifact of sensationalism and collective dread. Psychologists study the Iron Maiden as an example of how collective imagination can exceed reality. They note that humans respond strongly to threats that they cannot confirm. The Maiden's empty coffin held infinite possibilities of pain. It represented what torture could be, rather than what it actually was. Yet in someone's mind, the Maiden's spikes became real and immediate. Fear of the unknown coffin accomplished what the unknown rack or iron chair could not. In theatrical depictions, the Maiden continues to appear in horror films and television series. Directors film its cruel form to evoke dread, even when the plot never shows it in action. Actors shudder in fear at the sight of its hinged doors. Costume designers replicate its spikes in lightweight plastic so that the Maiden can be wielded on stage. Special effects artists wrap victims in foam latex to simulate impalement marks when the coffin closes. Audiences still respond with first a gasp and then a mixture of fascination and revulsion. In art, the Maiden finds new life as a symbol in engravings and paintings. Painters depict her under a blood-red sky, spikes gleaming in moonlight, as a creature of vengeance. Poets write about the Maiden's silent promise of suffering. Musicians compose dark ambient scores that capture the coffin's creak and the imagined drip of blood. All of these works draw on the emotional power of the maiden's form, rather than any proven historical use. Looking at the Iron Maiden today, one sees both artifice and authenticity. The coffin's spikes may never have claimed a single life, but their presence in culture echoes the very real fear of torture. The device's legend reveals an era when imagination and rumor wielded authority, and when the promise of suffering could shape behavior more effectively than actual instruments of pain. The Iron Maiden's name endures as a testament to the power of fear over flesh and to the human capacity to imagine horror in the spaces between myth and reality. You step into the courtyard before dawn, where the morning mist curls around a massive bronze form shaped like a bull. The metal surface gleams faintly in the pale light. You hear the coals crackling beneath the platform on which the sculpture stands. This is the brazen bull, a device of ancient cruelty revived in legend and occasionally in practice long after its first brutal invention. In the shadow of medieval towers, the tale of the bull carried on as a warning of unspeakable torment. Tonight you will learn how it worked, and why its design turned a man's final cries into the roar of a beast. The bull's creator in legend was a tyrant named Phalaris, who ruled in the 5th century before the Common Era. He commissioned a bronze artisan to build a hollow chamber in the shape of a bull large enough for a man to stand upright inside. The artisan concealed ear openings that connected to a series of metal tubes and hollow spaces leading to the nostrils and mouth. When the bull was set over a fire with coals stoked to a white heat, the victim inside would scream as the flames licked his flesh. The voice would pass through the tubes and emerge from the nostrils as a sound that resembled the bellow of a raging bull. In medieval times, the device itself was rarely found in courts of justice, but the idea of using sound as a weapon persisted. Court chapels and torture chambers sometimes displayed a mock-up of the bull or carved reliefs of its silhouette. The noise of metal tubes and bellows was used to amplify the fear of an accused heretic. Guards would clank chains or bang metal pails in the corridors to simulate the roar of the bull, convincing prisoners that the beast awaited them in the darkness. The construction of an actual bull required skilled metalworkers and a large supply of bronze. The chamber had to be thick enough to contain the heat and stand upright without buckling. The internal space needed to be just large enough for a victim to enter through a trapdoor hidden beneath the belly. The floor had small grates so that ash and embers could fall through and intensify the fire's heat. The head was fixed with a sculpted mane and hollow eyes that served as vents to draw air into the furnace and feed the flames. When lit, the bull's entire surface would glow red like a living ember. The acoustic design was the device's most sinister feature. The artisan carved a network of passages inside the bull's head. One tube connected from the victim's vocal box area to a chamber at the base of the neck. From there, a series of bent passages led up each horn and into the nostril openings. The length and diameter of each tube were precisely calculated so that the frequency of sound waves would resonate in a low-pitched growl. Each scream took on the timbre of a beast enraged by pain, shaking the walls with a sound no human voice could match. In the earliest accounts, the bull was used sparingly, as the process of heating the metal to white heat took hours of constant stoking. Victims left inside beyond a few minutes would be charred beyond recognition. Medieval chroniclers sometimes conflated the brazen bull with other forms of fire torture, such as the Judas cradle or roasting on a spit. They spoke of council meetings in dim chambers where nobles debated whether such cruelty was ever justified by law or necessity. In strict codes of Christian mercy, these stories often served as cautionary tales against excessive punishment. Despite its rarity, the bull cast a long shadow in popular imagination. Ballads and poems told of knights and rebels locked in the bronze shell for daring to stand against their lords. The bull's roar became a symbol of tyrannical power that no man could defy. Those who labored in castle foundries would whisper that to forge a bull was to flirt with madness. Metal workers refused to leave their anvils when guests spoke of giants buried under iron or of heroes who escaped from the bull by clever trickery. One legend tells of a grateful artisan who tricked his tyrant master by crafting a secret lever. At the moment the victim climbed inside the bull, the artisan activated a hidden dimension of the mechanism. The door swung open from the inside, allowing the prisoner to slip out once the flames had not yet reached a fatal heat. Medieval storytellers cast this hero as a figure of hope among the hopeless. Yet no genuine record exists of a bull actually being used in medieval courts, and no skeleton has ever been found within a bull's shell. In museums today, replicas of the brazen bull stand beside genuine racks and chairs of torture. Visitors lean in to peer through the bull's mouth and imagine the flames beneath. The placard explains that while the original device may never have existed in this exact form in the Middle Ages, its legend influenced laws and attitudes toward torture. The bull reminds us that the threat of horrific pain can shape behavior more effectively than any single instrument of violence. In the dusty quiet of a museum gallery, you feel a chill as you walk past the bull. Its bronze surface seems to absorb the light and emit a faint hum in your mind. You imagine the roar of suffering echoing through underground dungeons, shaking cell doors and sending guards scurrying for courage. You know that the bull's power lay not only in its heat or its spikes, but in its ability to turn the human voice into the fury of a beast. It stands as a testament to the darkest corners of human creativity, where craftsmanship and cruelty combine to forge an instrument of terror that lives on not in use but in our worst nightmares. Beyond the myths and theatrical revivals, the brazen bull's story continued to evolve through the medieval and early modern eras. Travelers and chroniclers carried tales of the bull into distant lands where no metalwork of that design ever existed. In Spain, some writers claimed that heretics were burned in bull-shaped ovens to amplify their screams into the mournful bellow of the sainted martyr at Zaragoza. In Venice, adventurers told of secret societies that practiced bull-style torture in hidden rooms beneath the canals. From England to Bohemia, the bull served as a shadowy figure of horror. Yet historians searching archives rarely find concrete orders for a bull-style device. Instead, they encounter preventive ordinances forbidding new forms of torture. In many regions, torture required explicit sanction from the sovereign. When local judges petitioned for extraordinary measures, they were often refused. Kings and dukes feared that extreme instruments threatened their own subjects. They preferred confessions by courtroom pressure rather than gruesome spectacle that could inflame public sentiment. The few bulls that may have been built were likely prototypes or curiosities rather than standard issue. Some metalworkers experimented with bull-inspired ovens. In Monastery, chapter records bachelors at the foundry for a season describe forging molds in animal shapes. They cast bronze vessels with horn-like vents and tested small-scale models over charcoal fires. Their notes survive on scraps of parchment. They record the interior temperature reaching a level that would sear flesh in minutes. A single marginal note warns that the experiment smelled of burning meat and drove away apprentices. Those foundry projects seem to have ended without further adoption. Despite the lack of widespread use, the bull's legend influenced architectural design in some torture chambers. Some dungeons featured vaulted ceilings that echoed cries into unseen vents. Prisoners sometimes spoke of hearing distant roars as they awaited interrogation. Guards claimed these echoes were rehearsed by hidden tormentors using metal drums or by winds blowing through narrow shafts. The effect was to reinforce fear of the bull for prisoners who believed it lurked in every dark corner. Artists and illuminators incorporated the bull into moralistic manuscripts. A 15th century Dutch book of vices shows a bound sinner inside a stylized bronze beast. The accompanying verse warns that unchecked sin leads to a fiery end that sounds more beast than man. Painters in Italian courts included miniatures of bulls in margin decorations to illustrate chapters on cruelty and tyranny. These images appear alongside representations of the rack, the water torture, and burning at the stake. Together, they constitute a medieval gallery of suffering, In poetry, the bull became a symbol of tyrants who twisted justice into spectacle. Minstrels sang of kings who rode in gilded carriages yet ruled like the bronze beast. They compared crooked judges to bullsmiths who forged metal punishments for the poor. Troubadours in southern France wrote verses where the bull's roar signified not only physical torment, but the spiritual corruption of power. These songs circulated in courts and noble houses as part of the discourse on mercy and governance. The bull also found a place in alchemical allegory. 17th century treatises on transformation sometimes referred to the furnace of the bull as a symbol of purging impurities. Alchemists wrote of the body of metal as the vessel in which base instincts were burned away to reveal spiritual gold. In that intellectual context, the bull shed its literal terror and became a metaphor for inner trial and rebirth. These writings helped preserve the memory of the device in a form divorced from its barbaric origins. Collectors of curiosities in the 18th century sought to acquire bulls or fragments of them, alongside mummies and exotic furs. Cabinets of wonder displayed spikes alongside taxidermy and scientific instruments. Visitors marveled at the technology required to cast a single piece of bronze in such a shape. Scholars debated whether the bull had ever been used on humans or was simply a spectacular example of metal artistry. These debates appeared in encyclopedias and travel guides that informed readers about distant lands and ancient customs. Today, efforts to recreate a working brazen bull for film or museum demonstration face technical and ethical challenges. A scale model built for a historical documentary required consultation with blacksmiths, acoustic engineers, and ethicists. The model's tubes were kept sealed, and the fireproof interior remained untested with living specimens for obvious reasons. Sound designers recorded human screams in studios, then ran the audio through playback systems in hollow chambers to simulate the bull's roar. The recorded roar was then used to illustrate the legend without real human suffering. Modern museums present the brazen bull alongside frank discussions of myth propaganda and the psychology of torture. Visitors learn that the bull's main power may have been in its ability to harness fear. The replica stands mute, but the story rings loud. Educators emphasize that the bull shows how technology and storytelling can combine to create nightmares that outlive any single act of cruelty. In that sense, the brazen bull endures not as a tool of execution, but as a monument to the darker facets of human imagination and the power of fear to shape behavior across centuries. You step into a dimly lit chamber, where the air smells of damp stone and rusted iron. Before you stands a device shaped like a pear carved from solid bronze. Its glossy surface gleams in the torchlight. You see that it is composed of 4 segments that taper to a rounded point. Each segment is hinged, so that the pear can open and close like a flower bud. A long screw protrudes from the stem end, its threads worn smooth by repeated turns of a careful hand. This is the pear of anguish, a device designed to expand inside the body and tear flesh from bone with methodical precision. The pear's horror lies in its insertion. Prisoners accused of offences from blasphemy to theft could find themselves bound beneath it. A clamp held the victim's mouth wide or secured the device at the entrance to the anus. In cases of alleged sexual impropriety or witchcraft, a specialist might place the pear inside the vaginal canal. With each turn of the screw, the segments opened outward against flesh and muscle. The growth happened slowly enough that the victim's nerves fired in staccato bursts of agony. Not a single moment passed without fresh pain. Metalworkers crafted the pear of anguish with deadly care. Each segment fit snugly against its neighbor until the screw was turned. Turning required a stout key of iron. With each half rotation, the pear grew wider by a few millimeters. After several full turns, the internal expansion could split arteries and rupture organs. Yet inquisitors often stopped short of immediate death. They prized confession over execution. A few revolutions brought unbearable torment and prompted the victim to cry out for mercy or to name co-conspirators. Variants of the pear existed in every region where inquisitors reigned. In France, the mouth pear was the most feared. It featured smooth chambers to avoid cutting the lips on insertion. Its expansion crushed the tongue against the roof of the mouth, disabling speech and forcing the accused to beg in muffled gasps. In Spain, an anal pear variant was used more often. Guards would coat the device with heated wax so that insertions scorched tissue before the turning began. In parts of Italy, a 3-segment pear served as both mouth and anal torturer by reversing its orientation. Records from the 15th century mention victims hauled before the magistrate for mocking a procession or speaking against the local lord. They confessed to the smallest slanders under threat of the pear. One chronicle tells of a baker accused of secretly selling bread to the enemy. He spat defiantly at the magistrate and insisted on his innocence. The inquisitor ordered the pear applied in the baker's mouth. Within minutes, the baker's teeth cracked under the force, and he revealed names of fellow conspirators he had never met. The magistrate pronounced the baker cured of hubris and executed him by burning. The psychology of the pear of anguish was as cruel as its mechanism. Those who watched a single demonstration of the pear in action needed no further proof of authority's power. Guards paraded the device through market squares to remind villagers that even minor insolence could lead to unimaginable pain. Pregnant women told their children to hold their tongues lest they one day meet the pear's steel petals. Accusations and rumors blossomed in whispered fear, sparing inquisitors the labor of collecting rebels by sending them voluntarily to confession. Construction of a genuine pear required a master metalworker. Bronze had to be cast in halves, and then finely filed so that the segment slid smoothly as the screw turned. The screw's thread had to match the groove inside the pear's stem. Too tight, and the key would strip. Too loose, and the pear would seize before full expansion. Iron keys were forged with round handles to fit the toll of cold sweat and shaking hands. Surviving examples show the index finger worn from gripping the key under strain. By the 17th century, voices began to condemn the pear as an outrage to human dignity. Scholars argued that confession under such pain could never be reliable. Courts in some regions banned new tortures yet left old devices like the pear hidden in castle armories. Rumors of its use persisted. Travelers described pear chambers in the basements of great cathedrals. Women claimed the device had been used against them for sedition. Men swore they had heard the maddened screams of the pear's victims echo through stone corridors at midnight. Today, a single pear of anguish stands in a museum display behind thick glass. A placard explains its likely use and the absence of definitive records of actual application. Visitors peer through the barrier and shiver at the thought of its insertion. Some run their fingers along the pale metal through audio-guided narration. They learn that fear of the pear often exceeded any real chance of seeing its spikes up close. The legend taught compliance and obedience, even in places where no magistrate ever turned the key. The pear of anguish reminds us that torture devices are not just machines, but instruments of terror. Their design may revel in mechanical ingenuity, yet their true purpose lies in the anticipation of pain. A victim's mind, racked by fear of the next turn of the screw, becomes as vulnerable as flesh under steel. In that moment, authority wields terror more effectively than fear of death. The pear's legacy lives on as a symbol of how cruelty can be engineered to pierce both body and spirit with calibrated precision. Throughout medieval Europe, the pear of anguish gained a reputation for punishing offences as minor as idle talk and as serious as heresy. Clergy complained of laymen mocking sermons and threatening church authority. Guild masters reported apprentices speaking ill of their superiors. Local magistrates found in the pear a ready means to enforce respect and obedience. An accused blasphemer, once bound beneath the device, faced the choice of renouncing every unkind word or enduring the slow expansion of steel between lip and throat. A word uttered in anger could be as dangerous as a plotted rebellion. Court records from the late 15th century mention cases where the pear was ordered by town councils in France. A man who refused to pay his debts was brought before judges and accused of contempt of court. He pleaded ignorance of any fresh summons. The judges ordered the pear placed in his mouth. The twisting screw drove the 4 segments outward until the prisoner's jaw was locked in a grotesque grin. Only then did the debtor confess to hiding his goods from bailiffs. The magistrate claimed mercy and released him once payment was promised. Stories of this incident circulated in nearby villages as a warning against defying local authority. In Spain, inquisitors applied a variant of the pear to those suspected of witchcraft. A woman accused of casting spells on her neighbors was brought to a dark chamber. Investigators claimed she conjured foul spirits. They secured her head in a mouth device shaped like a pear and began to turn the screw. Her screams echoed against stone walls. According to one chronicler, she named the names of fellow accused women after minutes of agony. Yet no record survives of any trial proving real witchcraft. The device became proof enough that confession was forced and guilt was assumed. England saw occasional use of the pear during the Tudor era. Agents of the crown carried small portable versions to remote castles. When whispers of treason reached the king's ear, a messenger arrived with the pear in a leather case. A local deputy was forced to testify under its pressure. A rival noble family used the device to settle a land feud. The winner paraded the pear through market squares as a symbol of victory over his enemies. Townsfolk clustered around to gape at the metal petals that promised a fate worse than death. Italian city-states also record incidents in their archives. In Venice, a magistrate applied an anal pear variant to a corrupt customs officer. The device's insertion was said to burn more than it tore. Folklore suggests the officer named dozens of bribers just to stop the turning. The custom of public confession under torture produced rushes of accusation and counter-accusation. Merchants accused each other of underreporting cargo weights. Peasants claimed injustice in tax assessments. The pear served as a pivot in power struggles across many towns. Despite its notoriety, the pear never became as widespread as other instruments. It required skilled handling and carried a high risk of mortal injury. Torturers needed to judge the pace of the screw precisely. A single full turn too many could kill the victim outright. Medical practitioners occasionally accompanied inquisitors to set dislocations and treat bleeding. Records from Spanish orders describe surgeons summoned to apply herbal salves and splints. The cost and effort meant that only the most serious cases merited such attention. Stories often exaggerated the pear's use. Travelers to Europe brought home tales of merchants seeing the device in situ. They wrote letters claiming that every major city possessed at least one pear. These claims were impossible to verify. No inventories list dozens of pear units. Yet the rumors persisted because they amplified fear. An official decree might state that the pear could be used only with royal approval. Nevertheless, local judges dared to threaten its application, even when lacking permission. By the 16th century, critics spoke out against the pear. Humanist scholars argued that confession under such torment was unreliable. They wrote treatises condemning torture and urging legal reform. A French writer declared that the pear turned judges into torturers and justice into theatre of cruelty. Theologians debated the moral right of using pain to extract truth. Some argued that true faith needed no coercion. Others insisted on the pear's role in defending the church from heresy. Reformers in England and France gradually banned new forms of torture. However, old instruments like the pear remained buried in dungeons. Officials sometimes removed the screw to disable the device. The pear stood as a relic in a corner, untested for decades. Guards mocked it as a rusty curiosity. Yet those who remembered its reputation crossed themselves in fear when they passed it in the shadows. Today, the pear of anguish survives in only a handful of museum collections. Its polished bronze segments rest open to reveal the screw mechanism. Visitors peer into the hollow shell and imagine the twisting petals. Curators label it as a device of legend and question its actual deployment. Audiovisual displays illustrate how the pair was thought to work. A speaker explains that its power lay in promise more than practice. Psychologists note the pair's place in collective memory. It embodies the way fear can enforce authority more effectively than actual violence. In this sense, the pair remains a tool of power long after its use declined. It teaches that cruelty needs spectacle and story as much as mechanism. The pair's legacy lives on in cautionary tales, in fiction, and in the knowledge that a machine can shape minds without ever turning a single screw. You step into a low-vaulted chamber, lined with stone benches. At the center stands a device of cold iron shaped like an inverted arch. Two curved arms rise from a central hinge, each ending in a bowl-shaped cup. One cup is meant to cradle the shoulders, the other the calves. A heavy screw passes through the apex of the arch. Turning the screw draws the cups together and forces the body into a tight fold. This is known as the scavenger's daughter, a device of compression that punishes by folding flesh and bone rather than stretching them apart. Invented in England, during the reign of King Henry VIII, the scavenger's daughter appeared in records as early as 1550. Its name plays on a dark joke. Whereas the rack bore the name Daughter of the Iron Maiden, the compression device was mockingly dubbed the scavenger's daughter for the way it drew maltreated remains back together. Under the Tudor monarchs, it became one of several tools used against prisoners accused of treason, heresy, or sedition. Across the European continent, variants of the device emerged over time. In France, a model consisted of a heavy iron yoke that clamped the head to the knees. Knights of the King's Guard would lock the yoke in place and leave the victim upright against a wall. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, craftsmen added padded handles to the cups and improved the screw threads for smoother operation. In Spain, inquisitors preferred a version that attached to a post, so the prisoner could not sway or shift weight while compressed. The operation of the device was simple yet brutally effective. The prisoner stood with his back against a board or wall. The torturer placed one cup over the collarbones and another under the calves. A coat of grease or oil prevented the metal from cutting into the skin too sharply at first. Then the screw was turned slowly. The metal arms closed inch by inch, drawing the knees toward the chin. As the body folded in half pressure built in the ribs, the spine, and the abdomen, lungs were squeezed, so breathing became a desperate struggle. The heart raced, and the prisoner gasped for air. Pain came in waves. First, the rush of blood to the head made vision swim. Then ribs began to crack, and joints groaned. If the screw turned further, the force could crush internal organs. Yet inquisitors often stopped short of fatal compression. They used the device to extract confession or to terrorize potential sympathizers. A single demonstration was enough to cow the strongest rebel into silence. Medieval medical texts described the after effects in chilling detail. Victims who survived spoke of broken ribs that never fully mended. Some suffered collapsed lungs and chronic shortness of breath. Others developed curvature of the spine from the unnatural fold. In extreme cases, the compression left the prisoner unable to stand upright, unaided. Even after release, many bore the scars and deformities of that single session on the device. Psychologically, the scavenger's daughter was a marvel of intimidation. Unlike the rack, its mechanism was unfamiliar to most commoners. They saw only the sight of a man who could not straighten his limbs or speak without writhing in agony. Stories of the device spread through towns and villages. Street criers warned that even a whisper of dissent could lead to that iron arch. In the Tower of London, the device stood in a side chamber near the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Records show that Catholic priests suspected of disloyalty were held there. A witness described hearing a series of agonized screams echo off the walls, then cut off abruptly as though a vice had sealed the victim's mouth. Guards never spoke of seeing the device in use, but they carried tales of its power. Inquisition courts in Spain and Italy adopted their own similar compression devices. One Italian model, called the torture chair of compression, folded the body against a seated board. 4 padded boards converged as screws turned each corner inward. The boards pinned arms and legs until the condemned could no longer breathe. These chairs testified to a common medieval belief that compression could punish sin as effectively as the rack punished heresy. Surviving examples of the Scavenger's Daughter and its cousins stand in museum collections today. Their iron frames, rusted by time, bear witness to a past when torture was an art form practiced by craftsmen as much as by jailers. Visitors peer through barriers and read placards describing the mechanics and the cruelty. They learn that a single turn of the screw could transform a nobleman into a cripple, that organs could be mashed like fruit beneath the yoke of steel. Modern scholars debate how often these devices were truly used. Some argue that many served more as props of terror than as regular instruments of execution. They point to the lack of court records detailing broken bodies and lasting injuries from compression. Yet the tales persisted in diaries, chronicles, and ballads. The legend of the device inspired fear long after its practical use had faded. In performance history, reenactors sometimes demonstrate a scaled-down model. They clamp a volunteer's forearms and calves in padded cups and turn the screw only until the volunteer winces. The effect still elicits gasps from onlookers. It shows how universal the human response is to forced compression. The device exploits the body's vulnerability to bending and twisting at unnatural angles. The Scavenger's Daughter remains a haunting symbol of medieval justice. Its design inverts the familiar pattern of stretching to inflict pain, and instead crushes and folds the flesh. It demonstrates an unsettling creativity in torment that regarded the human form as malleable. In every clank of the screw and every click of the ratchet there echoed the voice of authority demanding confession and control. Today, we view the device through the lens of human rights. We condemn torture in all its forms. We study tools like the Scavenger's Daughter, not for instruction, but as reminders of the depths of cruelty to which our ancestors sank. In museum halls and documentaries, its story looms as a testament to suffering and to the progress of law toward mercy. Yet as we walk past that iron arch, let us remember the screams that once echoed beneath it and vow never to let terror reclaim its place in justice. In regions where the rack thrived, the Scavenger's Daughter emerged as its sinister counterpart. In England it was called Device A, in Ireland Device B, and on the continent it bore names reflecting local law. In each case the core concept remained the same. A metal yoke or frame clamped the prisoner's head to his knees, folding the body in half. But craftsmen across Europe introduced variations that altered its brutality and efficiency. In England, the device consisted of 2 iron bars, joined by a hinge at the center. One bar pressed against the back of the neck, the other against the shins. A screw mechanism at the hinge tightened the bars, forcing the victim's torso into an acute angle. The pressure on spine and rib cage was intense. Even a few turns of the screw could fracture vertebrae or puncture lungs. English jailers sometimes padded the shin board to prevent the device from cutting flesh too quickly, prolonging agony. Across the Irish Sea, a variant placed the pivot beneath the kneecaps. The backboard was curved to fit the natural arch of the spine. When tightened, the device bent the body so sharply that the prisoner resembled a fetal position. In damp dungeons, men subjected to this yoke often lost consciousness from shock before bones snapped. The murmur among guards was that Device B forced confessions with fewer tears than the rack, but left scars no surgeon could heal. In France, inventors created a mobile version mounted on wheels. The prisoner was secured in the yoke, then rolled before a fire or across rough cobblestones. The motion ground bruises into raw wounds on the thighs and neck. The whispers spoke of judges who rolled prisoners through the market square so that onlookers could hear the tortured groans echo from beneath the device. Public spectacle became part of the torture's terror. News of the rolling yoke spread to courts in Italy, where judges borrowed the idea for their own ceremonies of pain. Italian artisans refined the design further, In some city-states, the yoke's boards were lined with spikes aimed at the base of the skull and behind the knees. As the screw turned, the spikes pinched skin without piercing deeply enough to kill immediately. The prisoner could neither shift nor relieve pressure, and so writhed helplessly, while mental agony mounted alongside physical torture. This variant rarely saw actual use because of fear it would kill too fast. Instead, it became a symbol in frescoes warning against heresy and sedition. In Spain, chroniclers mention a daughter of mercy used in inquisitions. Despite that ironic name, it spared mercy. The device was used to compress the torso until ribs cracked. Its secret lay in a pair of threaded rods at each end of the yoke. Turning them in unison produced a crushing effect rather than a simple fold. Victims forced to endure this compression filled the basement with screams that rattled the castle stones until they begged for absolution or fainted. Across all these forms, the common result was catastrophic damage. Victims suffered vertebral fractures, herniated discs, collapsed lungs, severed ligaments, and crushed organs. Even if the yoke was removed before death, few ever regained more than a semblance of normal posture. Medical treatises of the era described treatments with poultices of wine, egg whites, and herbs to reduce swelling and stave off gangrene. Splints of wood and strips of linen functioned as braces, but rarely restored full mobility. Survivors of the scavenger's daughter told of feeling their bodies fold beyond human limits. They spoke of hearing the ragged pop of bones misaligning and the rush of blood into cramped limbs. Some fell into cataleptic trances from shock and pain. When they awoke, they found themselves strapped to hospital beds in charitable infirmaries. There they learned to hobble with canes or crawled with broken seats in their pants. Few dared recount their ordeal, for fear that mention of the yoke would bring its return. Psychologically, the yoke's impact extended far beyond the chamber. Rumors of its use in one fortress spread to neighboring baronies. Peasants whispered that any word against a lord could send the offender to the dungeon and into the yoke's grasp. That terror reinforced obedience more firmly than any law or decree. A single rumor of the yoke's presence at a castle could cow an entire village. Even the suspicion of its use could cut rebellions short before they began. In cathedral crypts, certain inquisitors displayed an empty yoke frame as a reminder of divine judgment. Bronze and iron sculptures in cloisters depicted saints trampling demons beneath device frames. The yoke became an emblem not only of worldly power, but of spiritual trial. Preachers exhorted congregations to confess sins, lest they face a torment worse than the scavenger's daughter in the afterlife. That blend of physical and moral torture gave the device a legend that outlasted its physical use. Today, a single scavenger's daughter stands in a specialized museum of medieval justice. Its boards gape open like the jaws of a predator. Metal screw handles are polished from centuries of careless curiosity. Visitors lean in to imagine how helpless they might feel if folded beneath its weight. Curators explain that while the device was used less often than the rack, its mere threat shaped society's obedience to authority. In that sense, the yoke exerted power greater than any screw or hinge. The legacy of the scavenger's daughter endures in stories and art. Historical novels recount scenes of knights dragged into dungeons and folded like cloth. Filmmakers recreate the device in flesh and latex, letting actors scream through scorched breath. Its image appears in video games as a shrine of suffering to be avoided at all costs. Even in the digital age, the yoke's design resonates as a warning of the mind's fragility under engineered torture. In the end, the scavenger's daughter reminds us that machines of compression can be as cruel as machines of traction. Folding a body in half inflicts unique horrors that stretch beyond broken bones. The device's variants across Europe demonstrate how cruelty adapts to culture and technology. Its psychological power lay not only in the injuries it inflicted, but in the dread of its possible use. Today, the museum frame stands silent, yet in its silent form it still wields the power of fear over flesh and mind. you kneel before an iron ring set into a wooden beam. Your hands are tied behind your back with coarse rope looped through a pulley overhead. The torturer stands beside you, holding the free end of the rope. With a sharp tug, he hoists you several feet above the floor until all your weight hangs from your wrists. This is the strappado, a method of suspension that stretches and dislocates the shoulders with terrifying efficiency. Origins of the strappado reach back to ancient times, yet it became a staple of medieval inquiry and justice. Early manuals describe a simple apparatus of beam hook, rope, and pulley. Over time, inquisitors refined the method by adding variants, each more agonizing than the last. At first, the victim's ankles remained on the floor, softening the stretch. Later, the torturer placed weights on the victim's feet or bound the knees and lifted the body fully free so that the arms bore the entire weight. Under full suspension, the shoulders popped from their sockets with sickening force, then popped back with every drop and jerk of the rope. In the heart of the Inquisition, the strappado gained favor for practical reasons. It required little space or specialized machinery. Any vaulted hall or dungeon with a sturdy beam could serve. The Inquisitor needed only rope and pulley, tools already common in every castle. The slow performance of the strappado allowed the torturer to control agony and coax confession in measured increments. Questions followed each round of suspension. The victim, racked with pain and fearing permanent disfigurement, often revealed secrets or named co-conspirators in hopes of relief. Variants of the strappado multiplied across Europe. In Italy, a method called the cord was preferred. The victim's wrists were tied in front, then crossed and bound before the rope loop. Lifting them upward, twisted the arms backward, wrenching the chest and spine. In Spain, a heavy iron weight was attached to the feet after the initial lift. Each rotation of the pulley raised the weight further, intensifying the strain. In France, a drop strappado was used. After hoisting the victim high, the torturer suddenly released the rope, allowing the victim to slam to the floor before being lifted again. That fall aggravated dislocations and bruising throughout the torso. The psychological terror of the strappado rivaled its physical brutality. Prisoners lived in dread of the beam that loomed over their cell like a silent judge. Rumors of the device circulated among the condemned and sometimes reached family outside the walls. Merchants arriving in port cities heard stories of heretics who broke beneath the strappado and named innocent neighbors. Fear of this common instrument of torture kept accused persons compliant in the dock. For many, the threat of suspension by the wrists was enough to secure acquiescence long before any hook was cast. Medical observers of the era recorded the lasting damage the strappado inflicted. Dislocated shoulders might reduce permanently or heal in misaligned positions. Strained nerves in the arms led to numbness and paralysis. Cracked ribs sometimes accompanied full suspensions. Physicians treating survivors noted that even minimal weight on the feet during strappado caused severe muscle tears. Some victims regained partial mobility after months of splints and poultices. Others never recovered full use of their arms, living out their days dependent on servants to dress and feed them. Accounts from prisoners provide chilling testimony. A monk accused of heresy wrote that each tug on the rope felt like hot metal ripping through his flesh. A political prisoner in the tower recorded how the beam shook when guards added more weights to his feet. A merchant described begging the inquisitor to stop the questions until he could be lifted down and leaned in agony against a straw mattress. Their words survive in letters and confessions, illuminating the strappado's role not only as torture but as instrument of control. By the 18th century, critics began to challenge the strappado's legitimacy. Enlightenment thinkers argued that confessions obtained under such duress were unreliable. Legal reforms outlawed torture in many European states, yet the strappado persisted in secret chambers. In some regions, magistrates still summoned suspects to a hidden gallery for a brief demonstration of suspension before dropping all charges. The ritual remained a badge of authority long after law codes forbade its regular use. Today, chains and pulleys of the strappado stand in museum collections beneath dim lights. Visitors peer at the heavy beam hooks and frayed ropes. Curators explain the device's mechanism and its variants, but emphasize its status as a symbol of judicial cruelty. Audio recordings play the imagined crack of dislocations and the whispered pleas of mercy. Scholars reflect on how an instrument so simple could wield such power. The strappado's legacy endures as a reminder that torture requires no ornate machines to break a person's body and spirit. It only needs the will to bind wrist to beam and let gravity do the rest. Beyond simple suspension by the wrists, the strappado evolved into a device of terrifying variety through the addition of weight and creative pulley arrangements that magnified pain without ending life too quickly. In its basic form, the victim's hands were tied behind the back, and the rope gently pulled through a pulley fixed above. When weights were added to the ankles, the body lifted several feet off the ground. In more elaborate setups, a second pulley allowed the torturer to drop the victim suddenly before arresting the fall with the rope wheel. Each variation brought fresh agony, yet allowed the victim to remain alive for further questioning. One common variant attached stones or metal ingots to the victim's ankles. Weights of 20 or 30 pounds produced a relentless tug on the shoulders, tearing at ligaments in measured increments. By looping the rope first around the wrists and then beneath the feet, the torturer could switch the strain from the arms to the back and legs. Each shift forced new muscles to bear the burden, delaying exhaustion in one set of limbs only to intensify it in another. Victims often begged for release long before their flesh tore, because the body's own survival instincts rebelled against that sustained pressure. Another form of strappado used a sliding bench or wheeled platform. The victim stood on a low stool with wrists bound behind the back. A hook fixed to the ceiling grabbed the rope and lifted the person until the stool rolled away. This soft bench variant spared the torturer from placing the victim on a high platform. It ensured that no one could reach the victim to loosen the ropes without drawing attention. The victim's head dropped forward between the arms as the arms raised behind the back. The backward bend of the chest added further strain on the spine and neck. A sudden drop from a height of a few feet became another favorite technique. Once the victim had been raised to the end of the rope, the torturer might jerk the rope sharply or allow the victim to fall a foot or two before catching him. This jerk or drop could dislocate shoulders or collarbones in a single motion. When the victim's collarbone gave way, the pain brought immediate collapse of will. The victims often confessed out of terror that the next drop might kill them outright or ruin their limbs beyond any hope of repair. In some courts, the strappado evolved a short drop ritual. The victim was raised to just above floor level, then released to stumble forward on wounded feet before the torturer yanked him back into suspension. This method wore the victim down through dozens of such motions. Even if bones did not break, the repeated tug and release shredded sinew and ground cartilage until each movement felt as though fresh razors cut beneath the skin. The Spanish Inquisition elevated the strappado to an art form. Inquisitors prized devices that caused pain with minimal blood or disfigurement, since they believed that excessive wounding could render evidence unreliable. The strappado's reliance on slow torture without lacerations suited this aim. Visitors to the tribunal at Seville recorded seeing scaffolds in hidden chambers with ropes and wheels awaiting those accused of heresy. They noted that inquisitors kept lists of weights to apply corresponding to the accused's social rank or the severity of the alleged crime. Nobles might suffer a brief suspension while commoners received heavier weights to hasten confession. Across Europe, the device found favor because it required little specialized metalwork. A single pulley, some rope and shackles sufficed to convert nearly any low ceiling into a torture chamber. Small towns pressed white oak beams into service above cellar doors. The rope passed through a metal ring fixed to a beam. The torturer simply placed a footstool or box beneath the victim, then removed it once the victim's feet had been bound with iron shackles. Wheelwrights or blacksmiths could be enlisted to reinforce the beam with iron straps. Psychologically, the strappado worked in stages of fear and pain. prisoners first feared the sight of the rope and pulley. Each hook and wheel in the chamber became a threat. Just the sound of the rope sliding through a metal ring produced cold sweat and pounding hearts. When the torturer touched the rope, the victim knew the next few seconds could bring unbearable agony. The gradual build-up of tension was as potent as the pain itself. The mind imagined each new turn of the wheel or additional weight as a fresh arrow of agony to drive into the flesh. In the judgment halls of medieval courts, the strappado also functioned as a form of public theatre. In some cities, inquisitors allowed a small audience of courtiers to observe from a gallery high above the chamber. The victim's slow climb into agony served as both admonition and entertainment. Patrons of the justice system watched as each coil of rope withdrew the victim further from the floor. They witnessed the victim's body bend and straighten under weight. When the victim finally cried out or fainted, the walls echoed with both pity and relief that it was not their fate. Medical personnel often lingered behind scenes to record the effects of suspension torture on the human body. Physicians took notes on the pattern of dislocations and the weeks required for any recovery. They described treatments using vinegar compresses and salted baths to reduce inflammation. Yet they also warned that repeated sessions of strappado could leave permanent neurological damage. Victims sometimes lost the ability to raise their arms above shoulder level. Others suffered chronic pain in the lower back and hips. These long-term injuries carried their own social shame long after the tribunal had pronounced punishment. By the early 17th century, voices of reform began to call for the end of strappado and other tortures. Legal philosophers argued that forced confessions polluted the justice system and that physical torture was a relic of barbarism. In some principalities, inquisitors lost their authority to order torture without royal approval. The strappado gradually fell from favor as Enlightenment ideas on human dignity and legal rights took hold. Today, replicas of the strappado appear in museum collections with explanations of its mechanism and social context. Audio guides play recordings of rope rubbing on iron and the creak of wooden beams. Some museums show skeletal remains with healed collarbone fractures attributed to suspension torture. Visitors confront the reality that slow agony shaped criminal investigations for centuries. The strappado's legacy serves as a warning that the search for truth can be perverted into a quest for spectacle and suffering. It stands in museum halls as a testament to how authority can misuse simple mechanical principles to extract confessions, to exert power, and to instill fear in generations of the accused. You step into a low-vaulted chamber where the tiled floor bears dark stains and the air carries the scent of iron. At the center stands the Judas cradle, a device of unrelenting torment. Its core is a metal pyramid rising from a wooden frame. The point gleams under torchlight, as though it were alive. Around its base rests a wooden ledge, where attendants position the victim. The very sight of that pointed seat inspires dread, for all know what agony awaits those who must mount it. The design is deceptively simple. A sturdy wooden platform supports a smooth metal pyramid 4 feet tall. One end of the platform holds a vertical post with a pulley at its top. A rope runs through the pulley and attaches to a wide leather strap. That strap fastens around the victim's ankles. When the strap is pulled, the victim hovers above the pyramid. The torture begins the moment feet leave the ground. The body's full weight bears down on the pyramid's tip, concentrating the force on a small surface area. Attendants tighten the strap in measured increments. The victim descends a few inches at a time. Each new pressure sends searing pain through muscle and sinew. The skin stretches and tears around the intimate orifice. The slow descent ensures that nerves stay alive to register every excruciating shift. Muscles clench in futile resistance. Veins bulge and burst while the victim chokes on ragged breaths. No sudden drop offers relief. Instead, the torture builds steadily until only madness or confession can halt it. In some courts, the process began at no more than an arm's length above the seat. The victim would be teased and allowed to hover, tasting the pyramid's heat before actual contact. That first touch of metal sparks a primal terror that outlasts physical pain. Prisoners often reported that anticipation was worse than the pain itself. Each second of waiting twisted nerves tighter than any metal vice. In that moment, agony becomes a weapon of the mind as much as the body. Throughout Europe, the device took on many names. In Spain, it was called the donkey. In Italy, it became known as the cavaletto or little horse. French records refer to the bec de corbin or raven's beak. Wherever local tongues turned the device into metaphor, its cruelty remained constant. Designs varied with the wealth of the court. Some pyramids measured 3 feet tall. Others rose 6 feet and required a ladder for attendants to guide the descent. Each variation prolonged the ordeal or intensified the pain. Legends grew around the cradle of Judas, as it was sometimes called. Inquisition files claim a noblewoman survived a full hour before naming her co-conspirators. A monk, transported under suspicion of heresy, declared himself healed only after the pyramid split his sodden garment. Tavern ballads spoke of a rebellious knight who cheated death by grasping the point and letting it pierce his palm rather than his flesh elsewhere. Historians doubt these tales, but acknowledge they spread terror faster than any official decree. Physical damage from the nocuous ordeal was permanent. Victims who survived bore crippling injuries. Pelvic fractures, torn ligaments, and profuse bleeding left many unable to walk unassisted. Some lost control of bladder and bowels from nerve damage. Others carried gynecological harm that ended their childbearing years. Mental scars ran deeper. Survivors described recurring nightmares of steel points and the echo of their own screams. The Judas cradle served more as a symbol than a standard instrument of torture. Courts displayed a pyramid in the Hall of Justice to warn suspects. The mere possibility of its use could force confessions and expedite trials. Judges learned that showmanship mattered as much as actual devices. The spectacle of a victim forced onto a pointed throne hung in the public mind, longer than the rack or the thumbscrew. Today, visitors to historical museums peer at replicas of the Judas cradle behind glass enclosures. Audio guides describe the mechanism and its variants. Scholars debate its actual use versus its legendary status. Some argue it was more a device of rumor than practice. Others point to scattered references in legal records as proof that it saw occasional deployment. In either case, its legacy endures as one of the most chilling inventions of judicial cruelty. In the silent hush of a reconstructed torture chamber, the Judas cradle still commands attention. It reminds us that human ingenuity can fashion implements not only of progress, but also of pain. The pointed seat stands as a testament to the depths of cruelty men can conjure in the name of authority and order. Civilizations long gone once deemed such suffering necessary. Now it serves as a warning that agony can be engineered with slow precision to crush both body and spirit alike. You stand in the town square as dawn light glints on the rim of a massive wooden wheel mounted on a sturdy post. The breaking wheel was both an instrument of punishment and a spectacle for the public's gaze. Its design varied by region, yet its purpose remained the same. A condemned person was lashed across the spokes or laid upon the rim with limbs splayed. Each bone became a target for blows intended to crush without killing immediately. The wheel stood as a symbol of ultimate justice in a world ruled by fear of pain and public shame. The wheel itself could measure up to 2 meters in diameter. Crafted from solid oak or ash, the rim was fitted with thick spokes radiating from a central hub. Executioners sharpened the ends of metal-tipped clubs or iron cudgels to deliver precise strikes. They aimed at arms and legs in a ritualized sequence. First came the arms at the shoulder joints, then the legs at the knees and ankles. Each blow produced a crunch that echoed through the crowd. The torturer judged the force, so that the limbs fractured slowly, prolonging the agony. In some towns, the wheel featured a crossbeam for binding the victim face up. In others, the condemned was bound face down so that blood flowed freely into the soil. Some versions included a small platform beneath the wheel's underside so that the prisoner could breathe once the body was laid across. A cord tied to the prisoner's waist allowed a final breath after the blows had ceased. Death could arrive from shock or from exposure in the days that followed. Public executions began at sunrise to draw as many witnesses as possible. Town criers summoned villagers to gather with families and tradesmen before their shops opened. Merchants in market stalls paused trading, while milliners and bakers closed their shutters. Officials led the prisoner through cheering crowds or jeering onlookers toward the wheel. Some communities saw the event as ritual cleansing. Others treated it as a carnival spectacle complete with food vendors and musicians playing lamenting tunes on reed pipes. Once at the wheel, the prisoner was bound tightly so that flesh pressed against wood. The executioner, often a specialist, not a local guard, raised his club or fell unlocked to deliver the first strike. A sharp crack rang out as bone shattered. The victim's scream surged through the air and mingled with the clatter of metal armor on spectators. Yet a judge or magistrate often ordered a pause after each blow, so that the prisoner remained alive to face the next wound. This ritual could last for hours, until confession or death rendered the sentence complete. Remarkably, some victims survived the ordeal. Chroniclers recorded a few who lived despite multiple broken limbs. These survivors were hailed and feared in equal measure. They told of delirium induced by pain and of moments when fever overshadowed agony. These accounts spread through taverns and court halls. A man who endured the wheel without dying became living proof that mercy or divine favor could outweigh the torturer's skill. One record tells of a young rebel caught in a failed uprising. He was brought to the wheel at daybreak and received 17 blows before fainting. His wounds were treated by a surgeon who applied linen and healed the worst of the fractures. Months later, he returned to testify in the king's court about abuses of power. His survival inspired others to question the justice of such brutal punishments. The wheel's use declined as legal reform took hold. Philosophers and legal scholars argued that public torture corrupted the rule of law and brutalized both victim and spectator. By the 18th century, most Western states had abolished the wheel in favor of less cruel methods. The last recorded use of the wheel in Europe dates to the early 19th century in a remote province where central authority was weak. Today, a replica breaking wheel stands in a museum courtyard, its wood bleached by sun and rain. Visitors trace their fingers along the spokes in disbelief. Exhibits describe the medical consequences of crushed bones and infected wounds. Curators emphasize the wheel's role in deterring crime through terror. The irony remains that fear of the wheel accomplished what its physical blows were meant to enforce. The breaking wheel reminds us that cruelty can be systematized and presented as justice. Its public displays blurred the line between punishment and performance. The lasting damage inflicted on bodies was matched by a scarring of collective memory. Those who survived the wheel carried its legacy of suffering for the rest of their days. In that sense, the wheel continued its work even after the wood had rotted and the clubs lay silent. The story of the wheel stands as a testament to an age when pain was a public commodity and mercy a stranger to the law. You enter a cold chamber where the torchlight glints off the broad metal plates of a device built to crush rather than carve. It resembles a carpenter's vise until you notice the shallow ridges scored into each jaw and the coarse screw rising from its frame. The floor beneath is stained dark, and the walls are damp with the breath of centuries. You feel the weight of history in every echo of your footsteps. The head crusher sits ready like a silent sentinel. Fear coils in your gut as you imagine the plates tightening around a skull until teeth grind together and bone cracks under pressure. Origins of the head crusher trace back to inquisitorial courts where simplicity met cruelty in equal measure. Records from the 13th century describe a tool used to punish thieves and heretics alike. It required no elaborate workshop or rare materials. A sturdy frame of iron plates and a single screw sufficed. Masters of the craft learned to forge thick plates from wrought iron and to file precision threads so that each turn of the handle delivered a fresh wave of agony. The device earned a fearsome reputation among prisoners, who whispered of its ability to extract truths from mouths beyond pain's normal limits. The mechanism is deceptively simple. The victim reclines beneath a padded support that lifts the head into the cradle of the crusher. The torturer places one iron plate against the chin and the other against the crown. A wooden handle attached to the screw is turned with slow, deliberate strokes. Each rotation drives the plates closer together by millimeters until soft tissue yields first. Lips split and cheeks flatten as nerves scream in protest. Then the pressure reaches the skull itself and fine cracks spread like spider webs. Bone fragments slide over one another as the plates force the skull to deform. At any moment, a single additional turn can finish the work and reduce the head to an unrecognizable mass. The psychology of the head crusher relies on anticipation as much as on flesh. Victims heard the wooden handle click in place and felt the slight shift of metal before any pain arrived. That moment of waiting can stretch into minutes of dread. Your mind races with visions of the plates, inching closer to your brain, until you beg for release long before bone ever cracks. Spectators who witnessed partial sessions spoke of the device's power to break a will without even applying full force. A confession obtained under its shadow counted as a victory for interrogators who prized efficiency over spectacle. Across Europe, inventors introduced variants to suit local tastes in torture. In Spain, a foot-driven model used a lever that allowed gradual application of force without a screw. The victim's foot pressed against a pedal to turn the plates, shifting the act of torment from torturer to prisoner. In Italy, a double-screw version added a second handle at the back so that two operators could crank in unison and crush at twice the speed. French courts sometimes mounted the device against a wall with pulleys that raised and lowered the plate assembly. This allowed the plates to descend more quickly or more slowly in response to a rope pull. Each variation sought to prolong the ordeal or to heighten terror by adding mechanical showmanship. In practice, the head crusher taught obedience with minimal bloodshed. Torturers praised its ability to inflict pain that rarely killed immediately. Victims might survive broken bones beneath the jaw and still live to testify at trial. Medical attendants sometimes accompanied interrogations to set dislocated jaws and to treat internal bruising. Physicians recorded the device's effects in grim detail. They noted that victims often lost the ability to chew solid food afterwards or to open their mouths without a sharp stab of pain. Yet the threat of full skull collapse proved the most effective tool of coercion. Survivors of the head crusher carried lasting injuries that spoke of mechanical cruelty. Chroniclers wrote of noblemen returning to court unable to speak above a whisper. Their faces bore grooves where the plates had pressed too deep. Some lost entire teeth in one application or suffered hairline fractures that left the skull vulnerable to later trauma. Surgeons of the age experimented with splints of leather and strips of loom linen to secure the jaw, but admitted that recovery remained incomplete. The medical texts from the 16th century include notes on setting fractured mandibles and on applying poultices of wine and herbs to reduce swelling. Today, the head crusher stands in museum exhibits as a relic of judicial terror. Visitors lean over glass barriers to examine the screw threads and the worn handle. Audio guides replay a rattling click and a muffled scream to recreate the sound of the device in action. A sign beside it warns that myth grows faster than facts and that no record proves the device saw use in every region where it appeared. Yet, the legend endures because fear of its power-shaped behavior long after courts banned torture. The crusher reminds us that authority can use simple mechanical principles to achieve maximum suffering with minimal apparatus. The legacy of the head crusher reaches beyond its physical form. It serves as a symbol of how cruelty can be engineered to break both body and spirit. Writers of the Enlightenment invoked it as evidence of barbarism in justice systems that prized confession over truth. Poets compared tyrants to crushing plates that left no space for mercy. In modern art installations, the device appears under spotlights to confront audiences with the question of how far societies can stray when they sacrifice human dignity for order. As you step away from the crusher, you notice the next device waiting in the shadows. Its shape is unfamiliar, but its purpose is clear. You steel yourself for the next descent into medieval terror. With each chamber unlocked, you uncover more evidence of how ingenuity and cruelty intertwine to shape the darkest pages of history. Remember, every device you face tonight shares a common purpose: to command obedience through fear. The head crusher claimed the legacy of crushing truth from mouths that would not speak. Ahead lies the next chapter of horror and survival. You step into a narrow cell where the only light comes from a single torch flickering against damp stone. At the center stands a wooden beam, fitted with a long triangular strip of iron. The iron ridge gleams cold and unyielding. Chains and pulleys hang at each end, ready to lift your feet and shift your body weight onto that narrow edge. A leather strap lies coiled on a nearby bench. You feel a prickle of dread as you realize every nerve in your spine will become a fulcrum of agony once this device springs to life. Operation of the Spanish donkey is brutal in its simplicity. You are made to straddle the beam with your legs on either side. The ridge presses against your pelvis or your perineum. Once you settle into position, the torturer loops the leather strap beneath you and over the ridge. Then he attaches chains to your ankles and threads them through a pulley above. A slow crank of the handle raises your feet off the ground until your full weight bears down on the iron edge. Flesh tears, nerves scream, and bone becomes the axis of torment. Origins of this device trace back to Spanish inquisitors who prized its capacity to yield confessions without spilling much blood. Records from 17th century Seville describe suspects arriving blindfolded in damp corridors. When their hoods were removed, they found themselves astride the beam. The inquisitor's hand hovered on the pulley lever. Few words passed before the first click of the wheel sent sharp pain through the spine. That pain coaxed broken testimonies faster than any lengthy interrogation. Anticipation is agony's partner here. You hear the pulley wheel click into place. Each turn pulls you higher until the ridge bites through muscle and tears flesh. Before your body even feels the full weight, your mind aches with dread. You recall past cruelties and imagine the steel cutting deeper, warm sweat beads on your forehead. You try to breathe slowly, but every intake drives pain deeper into your torso. By the time the device holds you suspended, you beg for mercy just to escape the threat of suffering. Across Spain and Portugal, regional variants introduced metal spikes along the ridge to tear tissue more quickly. In Andalusia, craftsmen set the ridge at a steeper angle so that force concentrated on a smaller area. In Castile, a second pulley allowed alternating pressure on ridge and lower back. Some beams were carved from dense oak to resist splintering under severe strain. Each alteration sought to sharpen the device's focus on the spine, making each man or woman on the donkey into a living bridge of torment. Medical observers of the era recorded injuries that defy belief. Lacerations across the pelvis and lower back often led to infection. Deep bruising and crushed nerve endings left many victims unable to walk. Some men lost use of their legs when spinal nerves snapped under pressure. Physicians applied poultices of lavender oil or wine to reduce swelling. They splinted torn flesh with linen dipped in resin. Yet few treatments restored normal function. Survivors hobbled for life, haunted by a ridge of iron that once turned their own spine into an instrument of suffering. Psychological terror magnified the physical wounds. Guards left prisoners on the fork for hours or even days. Candle wax dripped onto feet to prevent sleep. Each time the victim closed their eyes, they risked unconscious movements that gouged new wounds. The mind replayed every twitch of throat and shock of sharp iron. When kept awake, the tortured lost sense of time, as fear became the primary sensation. Many confessed to crimes they barely understood simply to beg release from unrelenting silence. Binding body and voice together, the fork turned confession into a desperate gasp for mercy. Regional variants sharpened the device's cruelty. In Spain, inquisitors added small iron weights to the ring so that every breath pressed the prongs harder into flesh. They called this version the fork of penance for its vow-like demand for truth. In Italy, a bell was affixed to the ring so that each swallow jangled a sound to summon a guard's gaze. The noise proved more terrifying than the pain itself, as it confirmed both suffering and helplessness. French courts sometimes mounted the collar on a rod with a pulley, lifting victims until their toes brushed the floor. Each lift increased pressure on throat and chest in slow increments designed to prolong agony. Every adaptation honed the fork's focus on terror rather than on spectacle. Medical observers recorded the gruesome aftermath. Surgeons in monastic infirmaries wrote of deep lacerations on neck and chest where prongs had cut. They described skin folding over iron at the clamp's corners, forming painful pockets of scar tissue. Ligaments below the jaw stretched or tore. Nerve damage led to chronic pain or loss of voice. One scholar writing in Latin speculated that damage to sympathetic nerves could trigger tachycardia whenever the victim swallowed, condemning survivors to lifelong echoes of torment. These records underscore that few medical treatments could fully restore function once the tines did their work. Beyond direct injuries, the fork wielded symbolic power. Heretics condemned for defying doctrine found their bodies turned into living sermons of the perils of dissent. Empty collars hung in public hallways as warnings. Town criers rang small bells to mimic the Italian variant, linking sound and fear in the minds of villagers. Pamphlets illustrated the fork in meticulous engravings that spread its legend across provinces. Those who read descriptions felt dread, even if they never witnessed the device in person. In subtle ways, the fork's image enforced obedience long after its use waned. Legends swirled around the collar's potency. One tale from Andalusia tells of a noblewoman accused of sedition who miraculously stood on the fork for 2 days without confessing. When her release finally came, she collapsed in servants' arms but insisted she had seen angels in the cell. Another story in a Venetian diary claims a scholar mounted the fork voluntarily to prove innocence of theft, standing motionless until he was lauded by the magistrate. Whether true or not, these accounts passed from mouth to mouth and deepened the fork's terror. Rumor often achieved more than actual use. Critics of torture seized on the fork as evidence of judicial excess. Enlightenment thinkers in Paris and London cited its use as proof of barbarism in justice systems. Debates in parliaments and assemblies decried any tool that mutilated flesh for confession. Late 18th century reforms in France banned devices that pierced skin, yet hidden armories still housed forks, stripped of screws and chains, but kept under lock to intimidate suspects. Judges realized that simply showing the key to the cabinet that held the collar could quell dissent without a single clamp. Fear lived on, even after law forbade practice. Today, only a handful of heretics' forks survive. One hangs in a museum in Toledo, its iron surface polished by curious hands, before display rules forbade touching. Another rests in a crypt under a cathedral, a silent relic in a shrine to past sins. Visitors lean close to see rusted threads of the screw and the ghostly imprint of worn leather beneath the prongs. Interpretive plaques remind readers that no ledger lists every victim, and that many confessions induced under its grip met limited records. Historians piece together its story from fragments of memoirs and obscure court ledgers, acknowledging that gaps in archives leave room for legend, but also for the stark reality of fear engineered in iron. Walking past the glass case gives you a shiver that modern reassurance cannot erase. The fork appears almost delicate compared with monstrous racks and wheels nearby. Yet you know its power lay in minimalism. A simple ring and two prongs suffice to bend flesh and spirit. You imagine clasping the collar around your own neck, feeling the tines dig in as you struggle to breathe and to remain still. The mind recoils at the thought that such a small device could command such perfect obedience. As you leave this chamber, you carry the image of the fork's silent threat. It teaches that cruelty requires no grand architecture. A single collar can harness fear more effectively than chains or fire. In the next part, you will face the Judas cradle and another form of engineered suffering. But for now, let the prongs of the heretic's fork remind you that every device in this gallery shaped bodies and minds in service of power and confession. You awaken before dawn in a stone cell that echoes with the memories of countless torments. The air hangs thick with the scent of damp and sweat. Your head throbs from the laughter of jailers long gone and from the screams that once filled this place. As the first pale light seeps through the bars, you realize that these walls have borne witness to every form of engineered cruelty you have encountered so far. It dawns on you that no single device defines the terror of medieval justice. Instead, it is the unyielding union of psychology and mechanism that transforms each tool into an instrument of unending dread. Every torture device you have faced tonight springs from the same dark mindset. Power reached its apex, not when a life was taken quickly, but when agony stretched on without end. Let the victim remain alive yet broken, and the confession becomes endless proof of authority's absolute control. These machines were not built to erase evidence. They were crafted to writ it indelibly into flesh and memory. The rack perfected the art of slow traction, so that bones dislocated in measured stages. The Iron Maiden became a legend, whose fearsome reputation did more harm than any single spike ever could. The Brazen Bull taught that even sound could be weaponized to magnify agony. The pair of anguish expanded flesh against unkind metal until each nerve cried betrayal. The Scavenger's Daughter folded bodies like cloth to show that compression could shatter will as readily as dislocation. The Strappado used gravity and pulley to twist sinew and tear at nerves with minimal bloody mess. The Judas cradle forced bodies down onto a single pyramid point until every muscle rebelled under the weight of pain. The breaking wheel turned bones into brittle puzzles for the public eye. The head crusher squeezed skulls with surgical precision. The Spanish donkey turned the spine itself into a focal point of excruciating pressure. The heretic's fork welded voice and movement into a single cage of iron and fear. All these devices share a single, unspoken purpose. They prime the mind for defeat long before the body fails. The fear of movement becomes absolute. Each slight shift threatens fresh agony. The anticipation of pain amplifies every sensation until the brain surrenders to its own horror. Victims beg for mercy not because they fear death, but because they dread the next moment of living. Even when arms are broken or flesh is torn, the torture continues inside the mind. Memories of the last twist of the screw or the crack of bone become worse than any wound. Imagine yourself beneath this gallery of horrors. You step blindfolded into a chamber where a single device awaits. You know that no voice can warn you of what comes next. There is only darkness and the steady drip of water. You are made to stand or kneel or lie or straddle. Each position holds the promise of new pain. You feel the rattle of chains or the screech of wood scraped by leather straps. You hear the torturer approach with measured steps. Each footfall echoes your own heartbeat. Before you can find courage, your body becomes a shuttle between hope and terror. Only the most hardened might endure even a simple session. To survive a single day, you would require both physical resilience and iron resolve. Your nerves must learn to filter the pain, or else your mind will fracture first. You must master breathing and focus on something outside yourself, because the moment you fixate on any torture device, you become the device's victim. You must steel yourself not to twitch when the prongs tease your throat. You must tighten every muscle to resist the pull of weights on your wrists. You must learn to still your thoughts, even as the ridge of iron tears at your spine. Each device demands not only flesh but will, yet no one truly trained for this ordeal. No schools taught graduates how to remain motionless under a fork or how to blink without tearing flesh. Each victim learned in real time the error of resisting and the peril of submission. To last a day meant finding a balance between fighting pain and accepting it. You would need to master the art of partial collapse. Enough strength to remain conscious. Enough detachment to stop your mind from screaming. Victims who survived wrote that they envisioned themselves floating above their own bodies. They detached mind from flesh to become spectators of their own torment. Few succeeded. Those who did often emerged hollow and haunted. The mindset that forged these devices also forged their operators. Torturers became engineers of suffering. They measured force in ounces to prolong agony. They studied anatomy like artisans to target nerves and joints with precision. They kept detailed logs to refine their technique. A record might note the crank of a screw at every quarter turn. Another file might record the torque applied to a rack handle. These notes formed secret manuals of cruelty, passed from one inquisitor to the next. The search for perfection in torture became a scholarship in pain. Torturers also mastered silence. A single whisper could stop a victim's sobs. A thud of leather against flesh could ensure that screams went unheard by other prisoners. They rode devices into hidden chambers away from prying ears. The best torturers never drew blood beyond what was needed. They aimed for thirst more than gushing wounds. They understood that a bloody spectacle risks death before confession. A drip of blood is warning enough. A slow tear of sinew is a promise never forgotten. Society around these practices shaped and was shaped by the same mindset. Nobles and magistrates believed that public fear maintained order more strongly than laws ever could. Townspeople flocked to markets where a torture device stood on display as a reminder of authority's reach. A single glimpse of iron and wood in a courtyard cowed all dissent. Rumors of a device's existence spread faster than any official decree. Villagers taught children to fear any clank of metal near the gate. Obedience grew not from respect or justice. It grew from dread that any misstep might lead to that cell's door. And yet the darkest lesson lies in how quickly legend outlived reality. Many of these machines saw use only a handful of times. The Judas cradle may have held no one, yet became a symbol of unspeakable torment. The Iron Maiden may never have held a single victim in the Middle Ages, yet its legend locked countless hearts in its cruel embrace. Rumor shaped behavior more potently than the devices themselves. Fear became the greatest engine of control. When reforms arrived, they banned mechanical torture, but could not ban the memory of it. Empty armories still held rusted gears that no hands would turn again. Prisoners whispered that simple shackles could conceal a hidden spike. Judges brandished empty cabinets as though they held the last torture tool on earth. The myth persisted that the rack still stood in the castle dungeon. Even in the highest courts, the threat of devices no longer in use governed behavior. Today, these devices sit silent in museum halls. Visitors stare through glass cases at iron frames. Curators explain the mechanics with calm voices. Yet you feel a chill when you see a rack handle or a fork collar. You understand that cruelty requires no audience. It needs only imagination and an implement to focus fear. The lesson of Part 12 is that you would not last a day under these tools. You would break the moment you knew your body was their pawn. Only the most hardened soul might endure a sunrise of torture. A soldier accustomed to pain might survive one twist of a screw. A monk who mastered fasting might stand on a hot grate for a time. A terrorized mind might shut down sensations like a fortress against agony. But none could withstand the relentless promise of more. Hunger returns, fatigue deepens, wounds pound with every heartbeat. Fear returns stronger at each sunrise. At dawn, the torturer comes again, and with him the whisper of new machines. The final question remains why an entire era embraced such cruelty. Power corrupts when it wields fear as its only currency. When authority measures success by confession rather than truth, it transforms men into machines of suffering. Each device embodies a fragment of that corruption. Together they form a gallery of nightmares, built by fearsome ingenuity. As you step out of the gallery and into sunlight, feel gratitude for the legacy of legal reform. Remember that each device you left behind once shaped destinies, but do not forget that the darkest cruelty thrives in silence and in the spaces between law and mercy. The rack, the fork, the wheel and the rest endure in memory so that no one will ever again think that cruelty can forge order. Only empathy and justice can do that. Tonight, you have walked a path through human cruelty at its most calculated. You have seen how metal and wood became tools of terror. You have learned that devices injure bodies only to break spirits. Only one sunrise separate freedom from the brink of madness. In that knowledge lies the final lesson of Part 12. You would not last a day under these devices. And that is why we must preserve our shared vow never to let fear reclaim its place in justice.